This morning in our series from the book of Exodus on the Great Escape, and we read today from the second chapter of that book, reading from the New International Version. Now, a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I suspect there's not a more underappreciated task in all the world. Because even if you do it exactly right, the odds are you will seldom be noticed, much less thanked for it. I think of the stay-at-home mom who went to a parent meeting at the school one night, and while she was gone, her husband and daughter decided they would clean up the kitchen for her. So they put up all the food, they wiped down all the counters, they washed all the pots, put them away, they put the dishes in the dishwasher and ran it. Then they swept and mopped the floor until, overcome by their own nobility, they sat down and awaited her return. When she got home, she took off her coat, she hung it up, she walked through the kitchen into the den and began watching television. They followed her over to her chair and stood there for a moment. Then she finally looked up and said, "What?" Her husband said, "The kitchen. Didn't you notice? It's sparkling clean. We cleaned it up for you." The woman replied simply, "Yes, I noticed. Thankless job, isn't it?" I suspect a lot of women here today might agree with that woman. This morning, though, on this Mother's Day, we have the example of a Hebrew mother whose love for her children, for her child, took her to almost unimaginable places. Now, we're not told her name here in chapter 2 of Exodus, but 4 chapters later, we find out her name's Jochebed, and her husband's name, in case you are interested, was Amram. Both of them were from the priestly tribe of Israel. Amram, in fact, Levi's grandson. Jochebed was his father's younger sister. We can surmise they already had 2 children together, a daughter named Miriam, and then a son named Aaron, who would later on become the high priest of Israel. But then, as we heard last week, because of the growth of the Israelites, who were still living in Egypt, that's a good question. Why are they still there? The king or the pharaoh of that nation had already tried once to begin to thin out that population in a brutal example of ethnic cleansing. He told the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill all the male Hebrew babies they helped to deliver. We saw last week they didn't do so, however, and so as we read in the closing verse of Exodus 1, Pharaoh then ordered that every Hebrew boy that was born was to be thrown into the Nile River. And it was following that ruthless edict that Jochebed and Amram had their 3rd child, a boy whom the Jewish rabbis say was named Joachim, meaning the rising or the establishing of the Lord. Now, every child is a blessing from God. And in the eyes of their parents, every child's beautiful, of course. I think of a pastor who went to see a newborn child, and it wasn't really a beautiful child, and he wasn't sure what to say. And he just said, "That is a baby, isn't it?" There was something about this particular child that was different, though. Verse 2 tells us that when his mother saw him, he was a fine child indeed. Tov is the Hebrew adjective used here. And it's the same word you find all throughout the opening chapter of Genesis, where God looked upon what he had made in the world and he said, "This is Tov." He called it good. The goodness, the agreeableness of this child was such that the Jochebed saw in him some particular token of divine approval as well. Now, this is not to say Jochebed would not have done what she did had her child been ugly. But still, something about him told her that God had a particular role for this child to play. Long ago, Matthew Henry, the Puritan divine, suggested that we should observe the order of providence here, that it was just at the time when Pharaoh's cruelty rose to its height by mandating that all the Hebrew children be drowned, that the one who was to be the deliverer of his people was born. Isn't that just what we see elsewhere in the scriptures as well? Save the child, save the world. At various critical junctures in the story of God's people, a child is born who is instrumental to God's plan. Isaac is born to Abraham and Sarah when it's impossible, really. They're far too old. Samson is born when the Hebrews are under the heel of the Philistines and need a hero. Samuel's born to Hannah when the nation desperately needs to be brought back on track. And supremely, of course, Jesus is born when the fullness of time has come, Galatians says, and the plan of salvation is ready to be unfolded. Matthew Henry said thus, "When men are contriving the ruin of the church, God is preparing for its salvation." Those are some words we should hang on to today. But what could Jochebed do? She tried hiding the baby so that none of her neighbors, who were both Egyptians and Hebrews, knew he had been born. She managed to pull it off for 3 months. One commentator, who apparently never had children of his own, suggested that after 3 months his crying became too loud. I would have to say, anyone who's ever experienced the blood-curdling scream of a newborn knows that isn't the case. At any rate, when his mother could hide him no longer, she hatched a rather desperate plan. She got a papyrus basket, so verse 3 tells us. But we miss a lot if we don't notice the exact wording of that verse. Literally, she got a tiba. It was a box or a chest. The French word is coufin. We get our word coffin from it. A tiba was woven together out of papyrus reeds or bulrushes. The kam, as the Egyptians called it, gome, Hebrews called it. The only other place that we find this Hebrew word, tebah, however, is in Genesis chapter 6, where it's used to refer to the ark which Noah built. The Egyptians likewise built vessels, even large ones out of those same kinds of reeds. They could grow 10 to 15 feet tall, and they coated them with the same kind of slime and pitch Noah did with the ark, Jochebed did here. Specifically, bitumen or asphalt. It was brought into Egypt from the Dead Sea, used primarily for embalming. But in contrast, however, you can say that both in the case of Noah's ark and that of Jochebed's little chest, what Tiba really meant was a saving vessel. And then in what must have been an incredibly difficult moment, Jochebed put her beautiful, fine Tov boy into the little ark, placed it among the reeds, the Suf, along the banks of the Nile. Later on, Moses would lead the people across the sea of reeds, or the Yam Suf. Jochebed put the basket there so that it would not float away down the river and be lost to her sight, so that the reeds might shield it from the sun. Can you imagine, just for an instant, How desperate and wrenching that action must have been for that Hebrew woman. Let's be really clear. What Jochebed did was not just to put her innocent son into a makeshift little boat, a floating sarcophagus, if you will. She likewise put all of her trust in God, praying no doubt with everything she had. And I can't help but wonder if her selfless action, putting the welfare of her child above everything else, might not be an apt example for all of us on this Mother's Day. Anyone who's had children can tell you that being a parent means giving up an enormous amount of your own freedom for the sake of your child. Sometimes that may even mean giving up your child for adoption by someone else if you are unable to care for them. And as the news so often seems to remind us, there are a lot of people today who simply do not seem to be ready to give up anything when it comes to putting their children first. Now, I get it. Kids can be difficult. They can be aggravating. They are expensive. I am so excited to tell you all that as of last month, we have finally finished paying the last of our kids' college loans. And our son is 40. It takes forever. They always need something, don't they? It's a risky business being a parent, and there are no guarantees how your child will turn out. But if you love them, take the risk, no matter how much it may cost you. You don't even have to be a biological parent. Sometimes if you just love the children God has put into your life, there's a price for that too. I think of a 29-year-old woman named Irina Sendler. She was a Catholic social worker in Poland in the 1940s. She managed to save over 2,500 Jewish babies and toddlers from concentration camps and sure death by secreting them away in suitcases, in coffins, in sewer pipes, in rucksacks, in backpacks, even in a toolbox, whatever she could do to get them out of the ghetto. When frightened and distraught parents in the Warsaw Ghetto found it nearly impossible to part with their babies, they would sometimes ask Irina if she could guarantee them that their child would live if they let him or her go. And Irina would answer, I cannot guarantee your child will live if you send them with me. But I can guarantee that if they stay here with you, they will die. And so as heart-wrenching as it must have been for those parents, they delivered their children into the hands of an unknown stranger, not knowing if they'd ever even see them again. Irina Sendler was herself arrested by the Nazis, sentenced to death. The activists managed to bribe officials to release her. After the war, Irina was recognized as a righteous Gentile at the Israeli Yad Vashem Memorial. She lived to the age of 98, even being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. But of course, she knew none of that at the time she rescued children. She just knew they were in danger and their parents were in a panic. I have to wonder a little if some, not all, but at least some of the parents of the unaccompanied minors who have come to our southern border don't face the same kind of anguishing choice if they're living in a violent and dangerous place. It takes a lot of love to let go of what you cherish the most. And yet, when faced with the choice to save your child, you give up and you let go, don't you? That's how it must have been for Jochebed. She couldn't know what would happen to her son when she put him in that little floating bassinet. She didn't know if he would live or die. All she knew was that if she kept him with her, he would surely be killed. So she wove together that basket of reeds with her tears and her prayers. She smeared it with pitch and bitumen to try her best to seal out the dangers of the world. And then she put him in it and put it in the bulrushes and stepped back, lifted her arms to say goodbye, sending him down the river, so to speak, or to give him the only chance she could to save his life. Ironically enough, she did exactly what Pharaoh had ordered, didn't she? She threw her son into the Nile. Can't help but think, though, of how much of the world's history that little basket among the reeds held. Alexander MacLaren, a great Scottish preacher, once expressed it by saying, "Except the manger at Bethlehem, did ever cradle hold the seed of so much as did that papyrus chest." For God, you see, had a greater plan in mind for that boy in the basket. Now, we don't know for sure that Jochebed and her daughter Miriam, who would have been about 14, 15 at the time, knew that the spot where they put the basket or ark was exactly where Pharaoh's daughter would come to bathe, a place that was likely fenced off for protection from the crocodiles who frequent the Nile. It's likely that they knew that. But in either way, they still had no assurance of what would happen next. When Pharaoh's daughter arrived at the spot, she saw the basket among the reeds. She sent one of her attendants down to fetch it, and when they opened it, the baby was crying. And this is the sole instance in the whole Bible, by the way, in which the verb to weep is used with respect to an infant and not to an adult. But never did a baby cry so seasonably at just the right moment as this one did. Verse 6 tells us that Pharaoh's daughter felt sorry. She had compassion. The child, she recognized right away, had to be one of the Hebrew babies whom her own father had ordered to be killed. We likewise don't know if she was really thinking about taking the child to be her own, until Miriam more or less suggested it, planted that seed in her mind, offering to go find a Hebrew woman somewhere. I wonder where I could find a Hebrew woman. How far away is mom hiding right now? Offered to go find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. Now, both Josephus, the Jewish historian, and the Talmud suggest that Pharaoh's daughter tried first to get several Egyptian women to nurse the child, but the baby wouldn't take to any of them. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But what is clear is that Pharaoh's daughter agreed to Miriam's suggestion. And when she came back with Jochebed, whom the Egyptian, of course, had no idea was actually the baby's mother, she not only asked Jochebed to nurse the child for her, she even said she would pay her for her efforts. It has to be one of the craziest displays of God's grace and sense of humor anywhere in the Scriptures. Can I pay you to take care of your child whom my dad wants dead until he's weaned? Would that be all right? Jochebed did so. So for at least another year, maybe two, she was able to keep her Tov child by her side. Until when the time came, in another act of sacrifice, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, gave him up to be adopted. It was Pharaoh's daughter, in fact, who then renamed the child, calling him Moses, an Egyptian name to be sure. You'll find it often in the last half of someone's name, Ramesses, Ramses, Thutmoshet, Thutmos. Egyptians called water Mo, someone who was rescued, Usis. In ordinary use, it meant son or born. There was also a kind of a play on words for Moses. Sounds a lot like the Hebrew term Moshe, which means to draw out. And so Moses, Moshe, Masha, Moses, who'd been drawn out of the water, was drawn into the court of Pharaoh. Becoming, as some would call him, the Prince of Egypt. Later on in the book of Acts, St. Stephen will suggest that Moses subsequently became learned in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians. That would have included orthography and grammar. He was taught to speak the language of the Egyptians and to write it correctly, properly. Would have included arithmetic and geometry. Egyptians were sophisticated at both. Their calculations ran up to the billions. Would have encompassed learning, history, training in morality and good manners. Growing up in the royal palace thus prepared Moses for a role that his parents could never have envisioned for him. They wanted to get him as far away from Pharaoh as possible, and he ended up in Pharaoh's house. That should tell us God will always find ways to qualify any whom he has designated for great service in his kingdom. We sometimes think we need a bunch of training, or we need a bunch of education, or we need all kinds of preparation before God can possibly use us. But the truth is, as one once observed, God does not call those who are equipped so much as he equips those whom he's called. But it all began when a Hebrew mother of old took an incredible gamble, made an even more incredible sacrifice just to save her child. As Matthew Henry once observed, duty is ours, events are God's. And our faith in God can set us above the fear of men. It's no wonder Jochebed and Amram make the Hebrews 11 Hall of Fame in the New Testament. By faith, they saw that their son was no ordinary child. They were not afraid of the king's edict. So what are you afraid of this morning? Some of you are mothers here today. Some of you are grandmothers. Some of you will be mothers one day. All of us had a mother. We all understand some of the dynamics that go into families, and some of them are not good. But do you understand the dynamics of the family of God? There are all kinds of inherent risks in this whole proposition called life. That's been one of the ironies of the whole pandemic. Some people have been searching on a fruitless quest for 100% immunity, 100% safety. There's no such thing in this world. So sometimes, if you're a parent, you have to send your child out into the world. You have to put them in a basket with no guarantees at all. You have to let them go with only a prayer. 12 years ago, we let our daughter go. She went to England for her doctoral studies. She's never come back. Married that Englishman, keeping our 3 grandchildren hostage over there. But what I remember the most on the day she left was her birthday. Some of you know this. That huge escalator at Bush International Departures Terminal, Mickey Leland Terminal. It goes up into the heavens. So tall. Watched her ride all the way up on it until we could see her no more. To let her go. You have to let your children go, don't you? Trusting. That is the story of Moses and that of Noah reminds us. Our God is yet a God of safe passage. Who knows indeed just what God can bring out of the bulrushes of our lives? Moses ended up with 2 mothers who loved and cared for him, and 1 eternal Father who loves and cares for us all. Amen.